So I want to start with a quick drawing by oops, not that one, this one. So this is a drawing by a great master, John Singer Sargent. And oh my gosh, look at the simplicity, we would say, in drawing a nose. Now, if you remember last week, this would be a great exercise just for a warm up. So we're going to start here. We're going to start with a quick review of, hopefully, I bring it up every single time, your grip. Now, usually we go to this one or something like this, which is writing grip. I want you to really, really make it an emphasis. Catch yourself. Since I can't see you, you need to catch yourself really working out this grip. So what you do is you just place your pencil on your index finger and your thumb, or a variation of this. Now you can do the thumb over the pencil or under the pencil. And you could place your index finger in any of these positions. But what it does is it's going to give you a fuller range of motion. So for our warm-up, what I want you to do is start with an HB, a 2B, maybe even a 4B, and loosen up some of these lines. So as we look at the sketch by this great master, which probably was, I would say, something like a 2-3 minute sketch. The next thing I want you to do is, as you're working with the grip, I want you to keep your eyes on the screen, on the reference, longer than on your paper. So those are the two things. Trying to get ourselves kind of in the mode of, okay, I'm about to start a drawing session, get myself in that mindset. So what am I looking for here? I'm looking for angles. Notice that this is just a quick, easy way to start. I'm looking for just, is it close to the angle? Is it higher, lower, more open, more acute, and no detail. Notice that I could just go through this. How do I go through here? Well, here's where we get bogged down. Well, just start with the biggest, simplest. And remember, I mentioned we're going to work the nose more than anything today. Last week we did the eye. Now, am I getting a sense of proportion here? Where would I go next? From biggest and simplest, I would go to smaller and more complex. So starting with this, I would begin, and again, catch yourself with that grip. Now you can hold it longer, which would be great, or shorter for more precision, because that's the one thing you feel like you lack. But it's because of lack of practice. The more you practice this, the better and looser the quality of your lines. But most importantly, the way you visualize, the way you hold the instrument, the way you add pressure, and the variety of lines that you're going to begin to have to add. So for example, see me here doing diagonals, a bit of verticals, a couple of other almost horizontal cross hatch of diagonal, and little by little adding layers, edge, and sort of kind of sculpting our drawing, while at the same time I want to gain a little more understanding of the structure. Now this right now, working with a two-dimensional image, a drawing, might make it a little bit easier than when I have an actual nose in front of me, because of all those little curves and volumes that I need to deal with. So this is, again, just an exercise to loosen up, to work out. You should be feeling it in your shoulder already, or your elbow, hopefully not in your fingers. And I mean that, usually that pain from holding it too tight, where your knuckles get white, but loose, almost falling off of your fingers. That kind of looseness. And it's one of the things I like to teach the most. When you're drawing, you should have the mindset of sketching as long as possible. The moment you begin to think of it as a drawing, the whole thing changes. Your lines change. So looseness in the way you see the lines, the way you bring them in, the way you lay them down, should be number one. So I'm just going to go ahead and finish this up here. Not add any detail, but just begin to what we saw last week. If you guys remember, we saw the angles, but it all starts with that eyeball. So just a little review here. Looking for that angle, if you remember that. And obviously shading, which we will get to today as well. And notice the looseness, because remember, you're studying a master here. Notice these lines, how it begins to give you that sense of flesh, cheek, chin, all of it. Obviously the pressure that you could see where we get a little more value, a little darkness, a little switching the pencil. In this case, I don't think you need to, but just adding more value and focusing on those simplified shapes. And just like that, a quick sketch of our topic today, the nose. So just a quick 5-minute warm-up, but where I want you to go is keep these lines in mind. Remember, these hang in a museum for a reason. There's such a beauty to the way the lines were captured that there's something that you should try to emulate when you try to draw your own. And then take it from there, obviously. So our first exercise is going to be this one. Hopefully it's not too hard for you to see, but I will show you. If you're having a little trouble seeing it on a small screen maybe, what I want you to do is we're going to revisit let me go here, the same principles, where in this first one we're going to do a profile nose. So obviously we're working from the sample here at the bottom. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4 views at the top, or 4 steps at the top, the fifth. And then the final one, that would be the nose we're looking at. When you have a nose in front of you, we have that principle of biggest, simplest to smallest, at the same time lightest. So let's go ahead and do a profile here, looking for, visualizing the size, and we're looking for a light, sort of a sphere. It's a circle, but it will eventually become a sphere, which would be what I need to see underneath all the skin, inside the structure of the tip of the nose. And if you notice, there's a little bit of an angle. So they're not lined up. Now they could be, depending on the pose. In this case, there's a tiny bit of an angle. So if we were to line these up straight on the same surface, here we're going to tilt it. The other thing is the distance between them. Where are they right next to each other? Do they overlap? There's a little space between them. And this one could be maybe even a little more of an oval than a circle. If you see an oval, then you do an oval. Because remember, it is an exercise in observation. It's what you see, what you need to see. Next thing is obviously the size, how this and this relate to each other in terms of size. And from there, what you're going to see is a couple of angles. And just like last week, we dealt with those lines where we need to see them. You don't necessarily need to draw them. For example, we're here in that second, I'm in the second square, the second step where you see a green triangle. Now, it would be very helpful, obviously, to see this line that would go from the tip of the nose to just inside of the, or the top of the nasal bone. So whether it's like this, which probably it isn't, we're going to find that angle. And I'm going to place it just like this. Draw my pencil and lightly begin to construct. So already I could kind of begin to see a nose coming together. You don't need to add this one. But we could see already that there's a simplified way to structure this. Now, in this step, you actually look at what we would have in terms of curvature. I want you to skip that for a second. And the next one would be, if I have the bottom and the underneath of my nose where my nostril is going to be lined up, there's a point where there's a line, and it's demonstrated on the fourth step at the top, where you see this green line that goes straight up and down vertically, where you could line up the end of the bottom of the nose where the upper lip would begin with, and where that would line up in terms of the bone structure at the top. So those are points of reference for you to measure and line up as you begin to construct more of that likeness. And we're talking here about cartilage, bone, cartilage, and obviously muscle as we develop it. So once I have something that I could see, I could see the proportions, I could see the size, I could see the angle, I could go, in this case, to step number 5, which I would try to add a little bit of that roundness. Now remember, hopefully you're sticking with the grip. There is no detail yet. What I want to do is give myself a little harder edge, a little bit of the exterior, the contour, the roundness, and the key would be to keep it loose, knowing that I could come back. Now we're going to have a lot of what I call S and C shapes. What are S and C shapes? So notice, for example, here we have a shape that could easily be considered a really skinny S. And I like demonstrating that. I'm going to do it down here, where you have the letter S, but the letter S could almost be just a sliver. Or the letter C, where it could go from here to just almost a straight line, but still has the curvature of almost the letter S. Or it could be the opposite direction as well. Just going to clean this up a little bit. But it is important how you see not just straight lines, because at this point we're moving a little bit past straight lines. And what I want to be thinking about is negative space. So not just the shape of my nose, but also the shape of the space around it. And to see those S or C shapes a little bit clearer. So we're actually dealing with roundness. And sometimes, how do we translate something that goes beyond angles, that has just so much, it's very nuanced what we're looking for here. And you'll see that when it comes to noses, pretty much the whole secret is here. How we develop some of these S and C shapes, as we also understand what's going on underneath in terms of structure. It helps a lot, actually. So there's my S-C shape, very subtle. A little bit of that bone as it reaches the forehead here. Next thing, now going beyond these circles, it just gives me a little bit of clue how this would develop into my nostril. And it's almost, you could see it almost as a fish, as a bird with the tail, or anything else other than a nostril. You want to look for that simplified shape. Make sure you have the right size, proportion, direction, angle. And there it is. Followed by, now it's going to all come and make sense here. The edge of that second oval that I did here, which I don't want to make harsh lines. Remember from last week, if you remember, instead of drawing those hard lines around the eyelids, we develop it with value. And that comes just in a second. Whether the shadow goes this way or in and around, I'd rather have that slow development than just a hard cartoonish line. And now you begin to see, oh, well, look at that. What do we do next? Well, from here, there's a big jump, as you can see on screen, from step 5 to 6. And that is all about the development of value. So, value, squinting, I'm going to see my heart, my darkest area first. I'm going to apply some value there. And usually, I tend to go from lightest to darkest. But here we have such uniform, all around values that is so subtle from one change to the next that I'm going to just create the contrast with this, my darkest, that pretty much brings it alive almost immediately. And from there, what I'm going to do is I map out the light. So I'll remind you, the biggest tip I can give you is squinting. So when you squint at the screen and you look at a nose, I see the darkest area, and it's not that dark now that I see it. Can I map out the lightest areas? So you'll see it here. And same thing, I want to capture that shape. So there's light right here, pretty much in this shape. There's lots of light right under here and all the way around. And there's light right up here. Now the shape of the little map of light there is what I want to focus on. Let me get this a little closer. There we are. In order for me to begin my shading. Now the direction of the line that you choose here is crucial. Remember, we have lines that are going to curve up, under, and around. So the patience, the level of patience you can show here is a little more than that earlier sketch we did from Sargent, but it's not much. You don't have to overthink it. One of my biggest tips is this, and I'm going to show you on screen. You close your eyes and you touch your own nose. Now, if you could touch the nose you're drawing, great. But you close your eyes and you touch your own nose, and you feel the direction, and obviously trying to use just one finger. Sometimes, and it is a great exercise that we may do on a different day, where as you can actually get a sense and feel a nose, you begin to feel that, oh, look, there's sort of a curve. And I use the words concave and convex in order to begin to do C shapes that are going in, and you can see the actual direction of the line, or convex, which are going the opposite direction. And as you build up some of these, and they don't have to be, as I said, overworked, especially in this first layer, but the general direction. And a great tip is just to almost imagine if you were running your pencil over the actual nose. It would curve and follow the surface. That would be the ideal way to emulate the quality of lines that you want to be doing here. So notice here, for example, your lines, if the pencil was right on that nose, it would follow this way. So you create this contour line, this curve line, that eventually gives you a little more of that, what we're trying to do, an illusion of volume. Now notice that I'm staying outside of those light areas that I mapped out. So far I've been using a 2B. we also talked last week a little bit about using different tools for blending. Here's my paper blender. You can also use a paper towel, tissue paper, Q-tips. All of these things work really, really well. I'm going to use a paper blender, and now I really want to make sure I follow the direction. So using small motions that most of the time would be not just straight up and down or straight across, but circular. So you see me not mechanically or automatically doing circles all around, but there's a little bit of a, hard to put it into words again, but it is bringing a feel of three-dimensional direction as I create this grayscale, following the contours, just like the pencil, just like if I mentioned, just like you did the lines. This one, very similar to it. Imagine like you're putting makeup on it with a brush almost. That feel. You follow the same, and it's not just one direction basically. Now I did these lights of map a little too harsh there, so we have an answer for that. Our kneaded eraser. I'm going to go ahead and just bring some of this in and just gently tap it right at the edge. Down in here. Right at the edges up in here. I generally don't rub. I tap. And sometimes it's kind of a tap rub, which is the one I use the most. It's kind of like a tap rub in the direction. Where would I go next? I'm going to bring in the next pencil, which I started with the 2B. Now I'll go for a 4B. And that is just to close out, just finishing touches. Extremely light pressure. Lots of patience. Build up very delicately. A little bit of light into shadows here. So the transition from that early layer that I had down there, I don't want to just cover it up with darker graphite. I want to use it so it transitions smoothly into this darker one. So I'm using the same level of pressure that I was using with the earlier strokes with my 2B. But here, I can use smooth transitions, and I could render those. I could blend them as I develop them as well. And before you go too far or too dark, you pause and you check yourself. Check the level of contrast. And obviously, it all becomes stylistic. How far in terms of detail do you need this, your drawing, to go in order for you to be satisfied? Now, we're all different. I do like to see line work in my drawings, not photographic, that photographic quality of smooth rendering. I like a little more of that gestural. Not as much as the Sargent, although I wish my sketches could look like that, but just a little bit of the line, the gesture of the hand. Would do it for me. And there we have it. A profile nose with early basic. Think about where we started with a little circle and a little oval. and then little piece by piece structuring until you have something that's developing. Actually, this would continue as a really nice portrait if we were to add the other features. So there's exercise 1. For exercise 2, I want to do sort of a quick sketch again. Just like we did with the first one. This is more of a study of how is a nose when looking, and it's one of the difficult poses of it, when it's straightforward, looking right at you. How do I deal with that volume? So there's going to be an easy way. We're going to do that next. But first of all, I want you to, and you can follow me here, we're going to deal with just a little bit of anatomy. So we have, and you don't actually have to do the whole thing, but I'm just adding the ocular cavities here to this side. And if you guys remember, again, what we did last week with that circular, finding the edges, seeing a little bit of the bone structure and the muscle with circles and ovals, the planes, the side of the face. But just for now, I'm going to hint at the ocular cavity. So here we would have the eyeballs, but I'm going to focus more on this. So here we have a bone where we have obviously your forehead, your frontal. And right underneath it here, as it bends down, there's a small little angle, these diagonal lines, and right here, which I just call it a keystone for drawing. So we have a shift of light here. Usually this is a little bit in the shade. You begin to see if the light is coming from this direction, usually from above, you would have a little bit of shade here, which is why your eyebrow actually is there for, to protect the eye. From there, we have the nasal bone, which is going to go right, and that's that bump we see. So I'm going to see it there, and I'm going to go, notice how it goes and lines up just almost at the, and you can actually see it and feel it on yourself. There's a little touch of blend, and it goes almost past, having a little bit of my fan going on here, right to this point. And from there, we could actually do something where we're just going to go ahead and throw a line straight down, because what I want you to see it as is kind of symmetrical, the sides of the nose. So we have the front, and we only think of it as the front, but now we have a bone that is basically a whole structure going on here. We have a little bit of curvature to it that also gives you the likeness of the portrait you're drawing, this curvature or this bump, which we're going to define by just adding a break there. Notice the line here, dividing that cartilage into two sides, and from there I'm going to add two tops. So think of it as a cube, the top side and then the laterals, so the wings, the sides of the nose. And for that we need to find the angle once again. Let's come all the way here to the tip, the end of that cartilage, and then we have this fatty tissue, which is the tip of our nose that wiggles. If you just touch it, it just wiggles. And that gives you that third key component for likeness in your subject. And what I want you to see it again as is there's a top, there's a roundness to it, seeing the ball or the angles, and then there's a side. But first I'm going to go under and then all the way underneath. So the bottom of it. And this is all defined, as you can see here, by how the light falls on it. Now from here, you also have the wings. So just thinking of it as the sides of it. So I need 1 second. I'm going to take this paper really quick. There we go. And how all of these pieces just begin to, if you see them as simplified structures, in this case, not necessarily ovals or balls, but just the angle and the roundness of the edges, and see them as symmetrical. But what I really want you to see is how we have side, top, and bottom. And the bottom of it, you could actually see the shadow, how the light. You actually see a little bit of nostril here and the wing. And we can come down all the way where we begin to see this as the pieces. This is supposed to go a little bit lower. And then just the underside of it, which also shows you how the nostril falls into place as well. And sometimes some noses you can actually see the split in some of these parts. And finally, you may not be able to see it here, but we have light coming from above, so usually there's a little bit of shadow, and sometimes it's a lot of it where you even see it casting. Over one side of the face or the nose, just like this. Where this would be in full light, this would be just at a different value. And then obviously the roundness of it, the width of it, and those small SC shapes, those curves that become crucial on how we create that likeness. So let's go ahead and try it step by step. And here's step 1. So this could be an easier way for you to just repeat this exercise. We're going to look at it one more time, but we're going to do it step by step. So going back to a 2B. And this is another way. Instead of doing like I did in the previous one, where we do the bone structure and all the different lines, you can actually start it off as sort of a geometric read that in this case would go more to a rectangular or cube type of approach. Now what I'm doing here is I'm kind of getting a full sense of the length, the dimension of this nose by seeing the top. Notice that there's already a little bit of curve in this first line, but you don't have to. You could just keep them all straight lines. And the one thing that I would measure here is, if I measure from here, from the forehead to the nasal bone here, or my keystone, and I measure it like this, how many of these equal this bottom part? And I could do that on the reference. So I'm going to show you here very quickly on this iPad where I have it. So what I want to know is this measurement here equals how many of these? And I'm going to go ahead and measure 1, 2, 3. It's about 4 to right here. And then here it equals just, I would say 90% of the size of this. So it's not 1, it's actually 7/8, call it. So now we know it. This equals 4 of this as a unit of measure. And you can actually measure this also compared to the width. And notice that it's just a tiny bit wider here than it is taller here. And I want to use those measurements to help me get my proportions. So I could do that by measuring here. 1, and then 1, 3, and 4, right about here. And I know that this is just a little bit smaller than this. And that this, also unit of measure 1, is going to be a little bit wider. So I got to make this just a little bit thinner here. And just like that, I have my markers that should give me an accurate read, an accurate proportion of what I'm trying to do here. Notice there's a few lines, and the angles of those lines, it's what's going to be very, very important. How wide we go here. And little by little, you'll realize, yep, it is about just making sure we get good lines. And by good lines, I mean accurate angles, accurate lengths. And then give the sides. We did this just a little earlier, so another angle here, another angle here. And you should have something that looks almost like a box with weird sides or open flaps. But overall, a general idea of where we're headed, where we're going. Now, mind you, this right now would be easier if you're looking at a reference. So if you're looking at your nose, you would have the idea, okay, well, I see what I'm doing here. And I should point back at the one we just did a second ago, where now in this second image here, you can begin to see a little bit of the breaking of some of the lines, the cartilage that we talked about, where it meets the bone. Here we have something interesting. It just curves into it, and there is no break other than just the curvature of this line. So we don't see anything that would point at a bump here yet. But we see here the cartilage coming all the way, kind of like a dagger down right through the middle, right into the split here at the bottom. And we see softer reading with subtle curves that are outward. And it's the letter C and the letter S that I've been talking about. How we make good reads of curves. It absolutely makes all the difference, especially for this type of drawing. How we combine that which is straight with all of these curves that have to be precise. No other way to say it. How do we get those precise? There are ways, by the way, but we're not going to cover that today. That should be 4 lessons on its own. And it deals with deconstructing a line. But you begin to see sharper, smaller angles, a little bit of roundness. And I'm going piece by piece. You could be going in a different way. Maybe around this. See a little bit of that bone. And it's just hinted at. I want to begin to compare what this is relevant to this. And then the space within it, seeing it almost as negative space. So the thinness over here to the side, much thinner than the top, for example, here. And then it almost matches at the bottom while I capture that shape. And then the angle once again. And that brings me to hopefully seeing it. It feels a little small, and I may be a little short here on the size on the side of the nose. But at this stage, you can always rearrange. We're still at the stage where I could go back, and without having to use an eraser, we could rearrange some of our lines. That's why we do it this way, biggest, simplest, to smaller and more complex. You have a chance to readjust on the fly. And the other thing I would be doing that you don't see me do now, every couple of lines I would pause, step back about 3 to 6 feet and look at it in order to see the whole thing and be able to make the necessary adjustments before I keep going further and need to undo work that could be wrong. So there we have it. I think I'm near, and that gives me enough information for the next image, which would be, now you could see it. So it's the beginning of adding light. The beginning of adding the likeness to it. And for this one, I would go right back to the same approach, which is stay simple. Number one, adding a layer. Squinting is now necessary throughout most of the stages from here on out. I could begin to see the direction of some of these lines. But what I do is I begin to just build a little bit, little by little, lighter into darker layers of graphite. And there's a lot of things going on here that I don't want to overwork. So I'm going to go and I'm going to do it lightly. So I use this direction of line, and I'm just going to bring it right over to the other side. So a little bit of consistency of line is also something that it could stylize your work. It could actually make it look really, just that sense of consistency with line gives your work a little bit of extra interest that sometimes people may not realize it. Why does it look like that? Oh, look, all the lines are going in the same direction here. So there's a consistency of line that could play a relevant aspect in your drawing. Now notice here we have, and I may have skipped that in the previous one, we have a shadow happening down here. And that was a shape that I kind of avoided in the previous drawing. So we'll just add it here. And this is that cast shadow I was talking about earlier. So at this stage, you just begin to have fun. Your level of patience, the way you render. The way you look at shifts in value. The way you bring them in. The way you begin to play with light. And it actually becomes really interesting here because there's so much light. But you notice the same way we use the steps, that there's a break in the steps that is going to be overall just saturated with graphite. So you might as well, as you bring this, take a step forward and add that extra side of shade. I want to go ahead and lift up some of these lines that should have been lighter, but I just wanted to demonstrate what was going on there, which was that cartilage. And I'm just going to add a little bit of shade right underneath where you saw this earlier, and a little bit more roundness. So a shift in the direction of my line to add a little bit of curvature. So far I've been working with just one pencil, 2B. One level of pressure, which is really, really light. And when you look at the image, and you see everything that's going on with light and shadow under here, it should feel like a playground. Like, oh, that is, I could spend hours here. Because that usually is what would happen in order to capture that rendering, that light. You actually have to break it down, study, maybe not hours, but say at least an hour. And now I'm going to use my technique of blending. I want to use this soft, mapping out a little bit of that light that I see, so I'm going to avoid it. Although I could bring it in later with an eraser. This is going to be a little bit simpler because I'm not looking for the detail of light that happens here in and around the eye. I'm just going to make it a little darker with shifting value into our keystone here. And remember, I call that a keystone, just drawing term. I don't know if it's precise anatomical. It isn't, I don't think. And the more you know about anatomy, the more precise you want to be with your drawing, then the more investment, the more you need to study human anatomy. And draw lots of it as well. Draw the bone structure, draw the muscle, the cartilage. Tons and tons of images that make it easier for you to understand what's going on with the nose. So I'm just going to go ahead and blend all of this without losing my lines. Notice me using that round motion. And as I use that round motion, it literally creates that smooth round transition of light. So the way you use this, the techniques you use to apply the graphite, to blend it, are extremely important. The more you play with them, the more you test them out, different instruments, different blenders, believe it or not, sometimes different types of graphite. So shifting, finding the right pencil, the right type of lead, all part of it, of growing more and more comfortable with what you're doing. I'm going to go ahead and add a second layer of 2B, and this one I'm going to cross hatch just here at the top. And a little bit of roundness to it. I hope you're sticking throughout this whole session with the grip. Very important for you to go far, fast. You want to be using the right techniques. And just like in sports or so many things that require just that extra bit of knowledge, when you use the proper grips, everything eventually gets better and easier. Also faster. And if you struggle with it, don't give up on it. The more you practice with it, the more exercise you do to get better at it. Like these. These are just exercises to practice how you see light, how you break down a nose, but overall is how do I master my tool, my instrument? In this case, a pencil. How do I do different qualities of line? How do I manage pressure? Also, paper. Haven't mentioned paper. But yes, using the right quality of paper, the right type of paper, huge. Very, very important. Instead of adding too much pressure here, I feel like I should switch to a 4B. But there's so much shifting light from one area to the next that I think with the 2B, just shifting the quality of line, a couple of hatchings. You see what's happening here? We go from shadow to light, back to midtone, back to light. And you can do that gradually. A little bit of pencil, a little bit of blender, a little bit of pencil, and lots of patience, and lots of knowing what you're seeing, really looking and observing, because that is what it's all about in the end. Your experience and how you show us how you see things. Because even when we're all looking at the same thing, we all see it differently. Our life experience, the way we are, our personality, our culture, all of it comes through. Even the way we feel that day. We could see it. One of the fun parts of this is as you develop contrast, you check yourself and the level of patience, because as we get closer and closer to the end, we need to slow down more and more. And a big mistake that is frequent is rushing right at the end, where you lose all of this slow buildup, all of this work that took this long to get here, and then trying to go fast right at the area where you need to be more patient with the finishing touches and not being able to rescue it back, because what you have here you could easily lose. The other thing would be, I'm going to a 4B just to add a little touch of, really see if I could pop that extra bit of dark. A little bit of cast shadow here. And I'm already moving into the final stage here, where I want to see a little more contrast, a little smaller and smaller definition of the final line. And just popping, bringing up a little bit of light. And this is the best part where you begin to really manage that final level of contrast with the highlights. Bringing back light, going back adding a little more contrast or dark, and managing that final touch. As I mentioned, I love having those touches of line over some of these layers of graphite. And there we are. So this, as the exercise of structure, breaking it down, brings us to the final. And I want to do a test, just see if we could do this in the next 15, 20 minutes. So there it is. We have a nose. Not a photo, well, it's a photograph. Next best thing from having someone pose for you. So our next drawing will be, how would I go about deconstructing and drawing this nose? And we're going to try to do it simple. Not Sargent simplicity. A little bit of dealing a little bit with light in a different way, a little more rendered, not so linear. And I do see one thing that may throw some of us off, which is that those eye details there. Don't forget they're there. Just squint and look at the shapes, shadows. But it is the trick that I've been trying to kind of pass on today, which is how can I see this in its simplest way? First thing I'm going to look for is that those structures, the lines, I see there's a little bit of tilt. So one eye is just a touch higher than the other. There's a clue to it. It's not much, but it kind of bends this line just a little bit. What I'm looking for is that keystone. And there's tiny, tiny little clue. If you really squint, you see it very light shadow on it that goes right into the forehead, right at the edges of the eyebrow. But there it is. There's my little keystone. And now what I want to do is I want to find the angle and the measurements. It's going to be about 4 again. So I could see the top. And what we're doing is finding that cube. So I need to see the top, and I want to see it clearly, and I want to see the side. That brings me into another shape in here, which is going to be really in the shadows. And let's go ahead and I'm going to get ahead just a little bit. But here's my side. Now you could go back if you see it easier with curves instead of blocks. Then you do that. But be clear on what you're looking for. Right now, simplest, biggest, simplest. And as you can see, I'm staying pretty light because we also need to stay with lightest. I did add these, which are a little bit darker up here, just to create a little more of that volume. I don't see the other side, not completely, see a little tiny bit of it. And that brings me to, do I see the bone? It would be right here. I don't see it, but I see cartilage break right there. And that brings me here to the tip of the nose, where I actually see that very similar dagger shape we did in the previous drawing. That goes into the middle and then right into the front of it. Now again, I want to, before I feel like I'm starting to draw, I want to see smaller shapes. The smaller pieces. And I want to see them geometric if possible, simple. Barely any underneath, so I'm just adding a tiny little sliver of line here for the underneath, and what would be that wing we were doing earlier that goes right into it. So it's very, very little, hardly any nostril there. And on the other side, it's just a tiny, but look, it goes almost right to the edge of that shape where I could see, once again, that cartilage coming to the tip, and then from that tip, just a little bit of shadow, rounding a tiny wing that barely goes over the edge. And isolating these little shapes like this is what gives you more success. Because if I'm trying to draw a nose and a nostril here, isolating these smaller shapes, actually it goes a little bit higher. That's where it goes. Because it was just bothering me there for a second. Lost my focus. That is going to get me way closer to where I want to be. Here I'm looking at the edge and breaking down smaller shapes of this darkest area, which is my nostril, obviously, and how I could see that underneath. Beginning to add a little bit of roundness. Notice that this side is very, because of the way it's lit. And one last thing I want to add, notice this shadow right here. Shape of shadow, and a little bit of shadow right over here as well. And I think I'm ready to start shading. Once I have this, and I feel confident, I want to see the direction of the line, which almost feels this way, but here it feels, and I could see your best tool right now, squinting. If you can see the variation from dark through grays to light, that's what you need to be looking for. And I definitely see this darker right here. So I need to identify the shape of it. And now that I know it, how do I render it? Well, I'm using very, very patient strokes, very light, as you can see. And that's because this image gives me the sense of so light that when I want to replicate it, somehow my touch becomes really, really light. And notice I'm holding the pencil all the way at the tip, which also makes it way lighter. But now I can begin to see, before I add any blending of graphite here, I want to make sure I have clear areas. See if my line is matching what I see. And it's beginning to really come together. I feel I have good proportions, I have good clues. going outside of the nose here because the shadows actually happen. They're what create my line and not the other way around. Here's my keystone. And I should soften up some of these lines. They got a little dark on me. And there we have it. That's my first layer of graphite with the 2B. And I'm going to go ahead and blend this just a little bit. Soften up some of these lines. Now you got to watch out with blenders. Sometimes you want to blend a light area, but the blender has graphite that is darker. So you want to clean it up somewhere. Get it off a little bit. See? Like all of this got a little heavy over here on this side. And you also want to start with the lightest blends first and then move into the darkest. And that makes perfect sense, right? If we start with the darkest and then move into the lightest, we're going to darken the light areas by bringing graphite that is darker into these lighter areas, kind of like I did here. So I'm trying to get a feel, and remember, I'm touching my nose, getting a feel. I know it's not her nose, but just a reminder of the shaping, the direction. Never losing sight, focus on what I really need to be focusing on now, which is light and dark. What is light? What is dark? And not making up information, which means I'm looking at the reference way more, 95% of the time. Not my paper. If I'm looking at my paper longer than I'm looking at the reference, that means I'm making up information. And you can actually blend while looking at your reference. Just take a quick peek every now and then, and it's a short, tiny little 1 second little peek. But keep your eyes on the reference. That's the only way you really, really see what's there. The direction, the contour, but most importantly, the light. Bring in the second layer. Actually, I need to blend this too. Stayed a little bit away because it is a very delicate area of the drawing that can make or break. And add a second layer. A little more broken line here. I want to begin to really capture that likeness. My secret is look at the reference. When you're drawing your lines. If you're looking at your paper when you're drawing the lines, you're making up information. And it takes a little bit of practice. It's called blind drawing. Blind, not because you're not looking at all, but because you're not looking at your paper. Which means you're really, really looking at your subject. And as I said early on, cannot forget that all that we're doing here, all it is an exercise in observation. We get a little more precise, a little darker, a little smaller. And that's when you get patient. That's when it becomes fun. Trying to keep my lines consistent. Keep my pace slow. Notice how I'm bumping up some of the contrast. Using a little bit of that circular motion. And ready to bring back some light. Just a little bit of light. Let some of this line work show. And that is where I would stop. And there we have it. Drawing the nose. Next week, we will move into the mouth. So we'll combine eyes, nose, mouth. So for our final exercise, which will include all of them into one. So great work today. Looking at the structure of the nose. And learning to be patient, learning to stay in the right mindset, learning how to read the light, and use the proper grip. I hope you enjoyed it.